Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alaska, for being so hospitable. It is just so wonderful to be here. Governor Johnson, I think, is going to be here just a few days after me. This is one of our redoubts and potential strongholds, and we're happy to be here not only because we identify with the wide open spaces and the combination of don't tread on me and live free or die spirit here, but also because it's just such a wonderful damn place. It's just wonderful. So this year has been an unlooked for joy for me. I was minding my own business when my old colleague, Garrett Johnson, with whom I served as a Republican governor of a Democratic state back in the 90s, gave me a call. Said, what about running together on this ticket in the 5 months after the convention remaining? And I said, I have died and gone to heaven to be able to participate in a national campaign in a telescope period, in a time when third-party candidacies have never been more important, because the gridlock in Washington, D.C. is a huge privilege and an honor, and it's been that for me ever since Gary and I got together at his invitation, and I remain eternally grateful to him for giving me the opportunity to have a breakout year, which I have had. But, I say it's an unusual year for third parties. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them, which you obviously know, is that there are seemingly flaws on the candidacies of the two major parties, at least in the public mind. There are unfavorable ratings ranging from the 40s to the 70s, and that's unusual. But I think the real reason why it's been such a pleasure and a civic duty to run this year with the L banner is because of what's going on, what has been going on in Washington with our country's government. I think it started with the election of 1994, but whenever it started, Washington in the last at least 15 to 20 years has been polarized. Hyper gerrymandering has been part of it, so that the Democrats got more liberal to the fringes and the Republicans got more conservative to the fringes, and none of them was really scared of losing in a general election. They were scared of losing in a primary, so they got more and more so. And the partisan politics in Washington became just a contest to see who could kill the other party. That's no way to get anything done in Washington. I worked in Congress a couple decades ago when if somebody was going to give a big speech on the floor of the Senate or the floor of the House, the galleries of the House or the Senate would be absolutely filled with people coming to hear the speech, to see whether they were going to be persuaded, whether this speech was going to move the needle of the national consensus on the issue being discussed. That absolutely does not happen anymore. If there's a big speech to be made, it's for polemical reasons only. It's given at 3 in the morning in the chamber of the House or the Senate, and the camera zeroes in on the person's head so you can't tell there's no one else in the chamber. And the desire of the two national parties to kill each other in Washington is replicated by the desire of the national campaigns of the two establishment parties, the R party and the D party, to kill each other. And they really get worked up only when they're talking about why it's necessary to kill the other candidate, not literally kill, well, usually not literally kill, and make sure that they get in. I mean, that's not a persuasive argument. It's an argument without any content. It's an argument that assumes its own conclusion, and that's what we've gotten this year. That's what we've gotten in all 3 presidential debates. There's a lot of arguments that assume their own conclusions and have no content whatsoever. So, I feel kind of bad about the way things have gotten to be in Washington, but there is some hope. What is necessary is someone who can come and speak truth to power of those two powerful parties in Washington, D.C. And that would be a new party that would have a permanent seat at the table. And the Libertarian Party, if we get even to halfway where we've been in the polling, less than halfway where we've been in the polling most of the last 5 months, to 5%, will qualify for matching public funding and for no more hassles about ballot access, so that there will be no more, please sir, may we please come into the door, into the room and participate in the discussion here. Both parties desperately need that. They need an honest broker. They know it, but they don't want to admit it to each other. But it's at a minimum, even if we don't get touched by fire and the election doesn't go to the House and Gary doesn't get chosen as the compromise candidate because the Dems will never suffer Trump and the R's will never suffer Clinton. And that could still happen. I'm not ruling that out. But as a bare minimum, this is a major thing that we can do by pulling together for the next 2 weeks for the good of the country. And this is one of the states where Gary and I think we could make a real statement, perhaps even take the state. It's a libertarian leaning. I myself have worked in Washington with Senator Murkowski, one of your own. I'm old enough to remember her father. And she is just, she's dynamite. I mean, she's, as you know, chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, and I worked with her on Governor Romney's campaign in 2012 on issues like the Keystone Pipeline and nuclear power. I'm with her on ANWR, and she's totally positioned to advance the economic position of this state. I'm interested, if Gary and I do get to Washington, in promoting the exploitation of resources that we have here, and I think that, I've been a lifelong environmentalist, but I don't think we have to sacrifice anything to develop the resources of Alaska and open up the traffic to the west, to the Pacific. I think overall, much more attention has been given to the pathway to the east of the United States, because that's where the media center, the power center has been in the past. But I do think that the possibility of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the realization that the next century is going to be perhaps not dominated by Asia, but much more Asia-centric than has been the case in the past, means that we do need to worry about the Pacific coast and focus on ports and pipelines and realizing the full economic potential of the great state of Alaska. So that's a particular thing I look forward to doing for this state. So as I was saying, the folks in Washington, it seems to me, have become obsessed with their own re-election, and they know they're not vulnerable except in a primary, so they get driven further to the edges, which means that you get a bunch of people coming to Washington who know very little about anything. All they know is, I want to repeal Obamacare, or I want to make sure the Republicans fail, and that's not much of a prescription for getting anything done. And I do think that if and when Gary and I get to Washington, and the Libertarian Party is going to get to Washington, it may be a journey of 1 year, it may be a journey of 2 years, it may be a journey of 10 years, but the time is going to come when the current polling that shows that 60+% of the American people favor a fiscally responsible, socially inclusive, and welcoming mix of ideas. When that is going to be played out in Washington, and the Libertarian Party is going to be the #1 party in Washington, D.C., not the #3 party. Yeah. I'm not trying to be pie in the sky. I just see sort of an ineluctable march in that direction, because I do think that the desire of many in the current Republican Party to be as mean-spirited as conceivably possible, and they got to their convention in Cleveland with a very mean-spirited platform on social issues, and they said, well, can we possibly make this more mean-spirited? And the answer was yes, they could, and they did. So we're going to have all gays and lesbians undergo conversion therapy to cure them. This is just not a starter. And Gary and I have, each, I think, to our credit, been out there for a decade by ourselves on social issues, on the welcoming and inclusive and non-dirigiste, non-nanny state side. In my own case, it was gay, lesbian, civil rights. I came to office in the 90s. I had many gay and lesbian friends, and I immediately set about issuing executive orders that said, okay, we're going to have visitation rights, we're going to have bereavement rights. I'm going to appoint 3 gay and lesbian members to my cabinet. My first 3 judicial picks were all lesbian jurists. And I used the L word, which my predecessor, Michael Dukakis, had never used in public. Bad sign. So I was up there by myself for 10 years on that issue, and everyone said, you're crazy, but it didn't do me any lasting harm. Picking up almost where I left off, beginning in 1999, Gary was out there by himself for a decade on the issue of legalizing marijuana. He, came to the conclusion that it was less harmful than alcohol, that actually the war on drugs had promoted a lack of confidence between the police and a lot of people who really weren't lawbreakers. They really weren't felons. 100 million people in the United States have smoked marijuana when it was not lawful. So we have 100 million secret felons in our midst. We have a higher incarceration rate than Russia, China, and South Africa under de Klerk, the apartheid regime. And as Gary likes to say, he refuses to believe that we are less law-abiding than any other country in the world, and that's doubtless so. But it was just misconceived, misguided government policies that just got too enthusiastic. And Gary's had a big influence on me in that department. Criminal justice reform. I was for 7 years prosecutor in the Justice Department under President Reagan, but I've come to believe that mandatory minimums are not the way to go. 10 years mandatory minimum for having sold 7 ounces of marijuana 3 times. Please. That addiction and related behaviors really should be treated as what they are, which is a healthcare emergency in this country, as opposed to a fit topic for criminal justice treatment from the get-go. I do agree with Gary on that, and he's been very influential in the development of my thinking. Just as an aside, the same type of issue comes up in the guns area. People say, oh, here's an AR-15, it looks kind of ugly, there's a pistol grip here. Why would someone need a pistol grip to shoot a deer? Maybe we should outlaw this whole class of weapons, 5-shot, used for hunting all the time. And part of the answer that Gary gives, which I like, is, okay, so you do that, then you have 30 million felons, more felons in the United States, because there's 30 million of those suckers out there. Maybe 10 will get turned in, but then you have 20 million more people who set their face against the police and against the forces of order, what should be order in our society. And Gary has taken a lot of criticism for saying that he thinks that the failed war on drugs has contributed to the, not even standoff, the completely unacceptable relations between the police and communities of color in this country. The question has come up in this campaign, do Black Lives Matter? And Mr. Trump says the answer to that is all lives matter, which is his way of saying I don't really want to address that question. And it's a dog whistle. His entire campaign, I think, is kind of a dog whistle to alt-right and other groups supporting him. And the correct answer is yes, Black lives do matter, and this is what we're going to do about it. We're going to go back to education, we're going to do employment, and like the situation of addiction, it's, if not a national emergency, it's a major national problem. And we risk the creation of a gunpowder class of young black males if we don't do something about it. And that's the kind of thinking that Gary and I would like to bring to Washington. Whether or not we start out in office, we're well and truly going to bring that thinking to Washington. And, I often say this year, for the first time, and I've run for office a number of times as a Republican, and I always felt that I was kind of part of an organization, right? A big organization. I never bought their policies on social issues, not for a second. I wore that like a monkey on my back. But I went along because I was with them on smaller government. Now, for the first time, I feel, they asked me in Orlando when Gary was able to get me the nomination by a whisker for VP for the Libertarians. They said, well, how do you feel now that you're not an R anymore, you're an L? I said, I feel free at last. So we're going to keep, however many years it takes, we're going to keep with this, I'll call it a movement, not a crusade, but it's pretty close to a crusade. And, you know, a couple of projects that I have in mind for next year, no matter what happens, are to press the idea of term limits for our members of Congress who are obsessed with re-election. When I was in office as governor in the 90s, I was the national chairman of just two organizations. One was U.S. Term Limits, headed by Howie Rich of Philadelphia. And all my congressional friends would call me up and say, can you get Howie Rich off my back? I'm a good guy, I'm a good gal. Who cares if I've been here 18 years? And I said, I care. And Howie Rich cares. So I never intervened to go against the idea of term limits, whether it's 6 or 8 years in the House, definitely a max of 2 terms in the Senate. That's the only silver bullet that I can think of to end the current way of thinking in Washington. People say Congress will never go along. Well, okay, that may be the case. It's a little known fact, but libertarians know it, that the states can have their own convention to bypass Congress under so-called Article 5 procedure and get term limits in that way. And so I think that's well worth promoting as we go forward to put further pressure on Congress. I think it may wind up being up to the states because Congress will never act. But that is a hugely significant thing that we can do. The other organization that I was the national head of was the Privatization Council, which was for public-private partnerships and privatization of government functions. There's not too many government functions that I've seen that couldn't be better performed by the private sector, to tell you the honest truth. When I first got into office in healthcare, mental health, developmentally disabled, public health area, Massachusetts was delivering all those services at exorbitant expense through great big huge red brick buildings that were filled to a census of only 16% of capacity, heated all winter long at enormous expense, terrible staffing ratios, 1 to 20, and bars on the windows. They looked like prisons, and they were. And the people inside were treated and thought of by the staff as inmates. So we got in and closed every single one of those facilities. This was an anti-statist, very rewarding thing to do, and put all the patients or clients, as we call them, into assisted living facilities of no more than 11 people in a house with staffing ratios of 3 staff to 11 clients or patients. And, you know, the result was that 96% of the family said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And so those services of the staff were farmed out to private for-profit organizations, 501c3s that have been trying for years to break into the market of caring for these public clients. Never been able to, because under the prior regime, I immediately succeeded Michael Dukakis. This has been thought of as a state function, as so many functions were. And we just saw it differently. And so these nonprofits, many of them from the poorer areas of Boston, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, which are the predominantly black areas of Boston, never been able to get a contract. They wound up ruling the roost. Them and my favorite social services agency, the Catholic Church, with whom I was at loggerheads by day over issues like abortion and gay rights. They were totally on the other side from me on those issues and used to, you know, hit me up one side of the head and down the other. But at night I said, okay, we're going to give them the contract here because the Home for Unwed Mothers, they can really do it. And in the education areas, parochial schools are wonderful. And there's such dedication there, and they're more efficient, frankly, than the government agencies. So there's a huge transfer of energy over to the private sector there, and I think we can use more of that in Washington, D.C. as well. That's another 70 points. So it's all good. Gary and I have, I think, without being rocket scientists, we have the best ideas for what should happen in Washington. I think we're the most appealing ticket in terms of experience to two-term governors in states that were of the opposite party, so we had to work across the aisle, so we've already demonstrated that we can do what's necessary in Washington, D.C., and what they've not been able to do to this point. And you have trend lines, you know, the unhappiness with the establishment parties in Washington, and a growing realization that Washington is broken, that should make it hospitable for us and our message going forward, no matter what happens this year. But it is vitally important that we get that permanent seat at the table. And if the voters of Alaska and a few other states can do the right thing, and we sense we're among friends here, then it's very likely that we will, at a bare minimum, reach that threshold and have that permanent seat at the table, which means you will have the great pleasure of seeing me and Gary Johnson for years and years to come. Thank you very much. Now, I always say in law practice that clients have the best ideas, and I always know, in political speaking, that the people in the audience have the best ideas. Could you all ask me any questions, and I'll try to take a swing at it. We have microphones set up somewhere?
I got a question on healthcare.
Yes, sir.
My idea of healthcare should be all privatized, and perhaps your combined premium and expenses any one year goes over 10% of your adjusted gross income, then the government would cover the subsidize over 10%. That way, the private market would have to compete for people, and they would have a stake in it because they would have to at least own 10% of their adjusted gross income.
No, I think that's great, giving people a stake. The question is about the healthcare system. And as I say, I'm not sure it's productive to ride into town saying we're going to repeal Obamacare, period. That's our platform, because you're just not going to get a dialogue going. But I do think there's things that can be said about the Affordable Care Act that need to be heard. There are two great imperatives in the healthcare system in the United States. One is lowering costs. They're out of control. We're 16, 18, going on 20% of the budget. And the other is the quality of care. And you know, the system, Obamacare, was set up to take care of the former, and it did make a contribution. There are 20 million more people now covered than were before, and that's a good thing. But it didn't do a heck of a lot for the quality of care aspect, because the whole system is run by the government agencies, government bureaucracies, and insurance companies. And neither one of them really has an incentive to improve the quality of healthcare between doctor and patient. So we need to get more decisions made by doctors and patients. I am not a healthcare expert, but you don't have to be to know that it would be a good idea if we could change the individual mandate so that instead of having a mandate to cover every conceivable health outcome from cradle to grave, as the nanny state would have it, you make the mandate to have a policy to cover catastrophic illness, so you're not left as a ward of the state, and that's worth something to the state, and it probably costs 10% of what the current cost would be. And after that point, people are remitted to private sector transactions between them and various willing providers. So Mary says, you have stitches are us, gallbladders are us. And someone could go to Gallbladders R Us and say, what can you do for me? Well, for $175, we can do X. These are exactly the procedures we will do. This is exactly how much it would cost. And here's the anticipated outcome. And if Y happens instead of X, we would recommend the following. Okay, that's willing buyer, willing seller, entirely private sector, no middleman, no government, no insurance company in the middle. Much more efficient from an economic point of view. The seller of the services is making more money, the buyer is paying less money. Just a couple of other details. And people in Washington don't think about that because their first thought is government. Government's got to do it or it'll never happen. And you know what the inarticulate minor premise is behind that? The people cannot be trusted. People cannot be trusted. And that's the premise behind the nanny state, or the dirigiste state, or a European socialist approach to things. We really can't trust the people. And, you know, sometimes I look at some of the programs and I think that they want government to do so much for us that they want government to lead our lives for us. And that's the opposite of the libertarian philosophy, as you well know. There's your pet peeve. So just throwing darts against the wall in the healthcare area. Why shouldn't people be able to shop for insurance across state lines? Why shouldn't people be able to get their pharmaceuticals in Canada? Why shouldn't people be able to have health savings accounts? And those are just prohibitions built into the existing system to maximize the power of government and the insurance companies, and they should be repealed. Yes.
Hello, Mr. Weld. Welcome to the last frontier. Getting around on the internet much lately, but there's a really ridiculous article out there that completely misquotes you by insinuating that you endorse Hillary Clinton. Now, of course, I know that's ridiculous, but I was wondering if you could comment on how the news media has treated the Johnson-Weld campaign thus far. Thank you.
You know, I did give a speech a couple of days ago in Boston where I said that I really doubt that Mr. Trump has the stability to serve well and competently as President of the United States, because the President has just constant criticism and pressure from all quarters. And my observation of Mr. Trump, particularly during the debates, is that when subject to direct challenge or criticism, he responds almost as a child might. He stands on one leg and holds his breath until he gets what he wants. He interrupts constantly. He turns red in the face. He waves his arms. You know, it's not how a president of the United States can, in office, behave. And I gave him his due. I said that the guy has charisma and panache. You know, many people, including myself, found those qualities for a time at least to be entertaining. And that may be his ultimate goal. I hope so. I've been encouraging him for months now to seek any job other than President of the United States. I've even suggested the laundry business as a possible recipient of his talents, but it does appear that with the alliance with Breitbart and Mr. Bannon and the possibility of a TV empire, that there's another job that might appeal to him if he's not successful in this campaign. And if he's not successful, he'll live. As a matter of fact, I think he could do well economically, but I really don't think President of the United States is a job that fits him at all. So I said that 2 days ago. Before I even said that, in the same remarks, I said Gary Johnson and I it's been a great, it is a great privilege to participate in this year's campaign, as I said here, and I'm so grateful to Governor Johnson for giving me the opportunity. And we're going to continue on through November 8th with our message of fiscal responsibility and socially inclusionary and welcoming policies. Translation, we're not going anywhere. And a little bit more about why third parties are good for the United States. So that was the speech. Never mentioned Mrs. Clinton or the Democrats once. So the commentary from the New York press, or bloggers maybe, is, oh, Weld endorses Clinton. Well, you know, I mean, you heard what I just said. That's just not true.
You tell me if you and Gary agree with the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission?
We're somewhat split on that, Gary and I. And, you know, we reserve the right to not see things the same way with the opening gun. We don't even see our first choice on taxes is a little different. But on Citizens United, Gary's point of view is that he'd like to have absolutely unlimited contribution limits. In other words, money is speech, with full disclosure, so that if a billionaire comes along and wants to give $500 million to Johnson and Weld so they can get elected president and vice president of the United States, that's good because that breaks the barriers of getting into the system and offers a long shot, a way to run the table. I see that, I get that. I am familiar with the practice in states such as Virginia, Ohio, and a couple of others that have absolutely no limits. So I've seen some unattractive state campaigns where you get one rich real estate developer backing the Democrat and one rich real estate developer backing the Republican, and they just up the ante. This is a famous case in Virginia where this happened. And so the entire campaign was just which real estate developer was going to put more money into the campaign and elect the next governor of Virginia. And, the people's voice was kind of drowned out. So I'm more conservative or pessimistic about the Citizens United decision, which really does open up the sluice gates for a lot more spending. I think it might have tilted the playing field a little bit more in favor of the corporate side and not exclusively in favor of the unions. And to the extent it did that, I approve of it. But I don't know. Increasingly, I think decisions are made based on social media, having things go viral on the web, and many people are not taking their cues from television, maybe some streaming, but otherwise it's the new media. So I think the day when a $1 billion bankroll for a presidential campaign is going to necessarily beat a $500 million bankroll, I think that day may be disappearing. Anyway, that's my view, and I'm sure I'm politically incorrect for at least half the people in this audience, but those are my thoughts.
Welcome for being here today. I really do appreciate it. I spent a number of years studying criminology, criminal justice, and I was curious to know what the Johnson-Weld plan is to dismantle the lobbying abilities of the private corrections system that has really contributed to the passage of a lot of arguably insensible laws without breaking the libertarian ideology of not getting too involved with private industry.
Well, when I took office, I'm a big privatizer, and I said I'll privatize almost anything that moves. One exception would be the prison system, because that's a non-delegable duty of the state. So that means that's the one area where I wasn't in favor of privatization. I think Gary had introduced private prisons in New Mexico. I think they've been introduced a lot in Texas as well. Somewhat mixed history. So I think we have an open ear on that issue. I gather there have been some misfires with the private management of prisons, and I'm sorry to hear that. It didn't happen, obviously, in my state because I didn't do it. But I want to go find out the reasons for it. Was it malfeasance? Was it failures in design? And I hope we would come out in the right place in terms of the mix between public and private, if any.
Would you be opposed to leaving it entirely up to the individual states?
Oh, I'm never opposed to leaving something up to the individual states. Are you kidding me? So by the way, just a data point, people sometimes on the legalization of marijuana front, they say, what's going to happen if you guys win or get control of the levers of power? If Gary Johnson is president of the United States, on day one, a couple things will happen. One, Edward Snowden will be pardoned, okay? Number two, marijuana is to be descheduled as a Schedule I dangerous narcotic, which means that issue will go back to the states. That's what I thought of it. But all the overhang that made bankability an issue for marijuana companies at the state level will go away because the feds will no longer be the impediment. So that's a good example of how, in one stroke, to empower and free, if you will, the people of the states to do as they would like.
Hello, Governor. My name is Derek Hayes. I'm a law enforcement officer, and I have concerns that I'm not necessarily the Libertarian Party but a future federal database for registering of firearms. And do you see the danger in something like that?
A federal registry of firearms?
But it was required to register semi-automatic rifles, for example, should the federal government...
Which we don't have now?
That's correct.
Yeah, no, I would say that's a step towards turn in your weapons, the government will take care of you. I was in South Dakota last week, and we passed through the town of Deadwood, and I got out of my car and went over to a shop where I'd seen a t-shirt, a big t-shirt, with Geronimo holding a rifle up top in the middle of it. And in the top it says, turn in your weapons. In the bottom it says, the government will take care of you. Just like it did Geronimo and his folks, right? But it's, it is a fact that in the course of history there have been examples where governments have persuaded people to turn in their arms, which they legitimately possessed, on the theory that the government would then be more able more efficiently to defend them in their country. And the people always got enslaved, and it didn't take that long either. So, there's a rich vein of history that supports the words of the Second Amendment that the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. And it doesn't say the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed except in cases of standing militia. It's like the First Amendment on free speech. It says shall not. So that's the beginning and the ending of that analysis. So the answer is, yeah, no, that would be a terrible thing.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming here, and welcome to the Western. I'm a Trump fan, a Logan fan. I came here tonight to respectfully beseech you to make a consideration for something. And before I ask that question, I want those people here to know that I love you folks in the Tea Party, okay? But I am a right-wing Republican, fed up white American who wants this country back. But I respectfully and sincerely beseech you to get with Trump and come on board in some way. It is my opinion that the complex arrangements we have now, which look almost nearly irreparable in my country, it's going to take a council of minds to get through some of these, and Trump is the only way to wedge into this, but we do need you folks there. And respectfully, I ask that you find that niche so we don't miss that moment.
Well, thank you, sir, and very well put. I mean, I think the time for that, and I said this, including in my fire-breathing speech about instability 2 days ago, I said, look, the country is going to need people to come together no matter who wins the election, and no matter who wins, let's assume it's the D or the R. I will go to the D or the R, including if it's Mr. Trump, and say, offer my services to do anything I can to promote dialogue and harmony in the country. Because one of the bad things that's happened, and this isn't Mr. Trump's doing, it's something that's happened in Washington over the last 15, 20 years, is that the people are not talking to each other, they're not interested in dialogue, and they need some people from the middle. And I do believe that, I don't even know that it's accurate to call Gary and me moderate Republicans. We're right-wing Republicans on fiscal issues, and we're left-wing Republicans on social issues. Maybe that brings us out in the middle. But we have a point of view that is not really against anybody. And if Mr. Trump wins, and we can be of any service to him in bridging the divide with elements of the citizenry, they could be Republicans, they could be independents, they could be Democrats, that he doesn't have any good relationships with now, and he's President of the United States, I absolutely would do that. I'm a great believer. It's why I was so troubled by his saying that he is not sure he would get behind the results of the election unless he wins. I mean, I can remember my father, who was a relatively fire-breathing Republican and very much in favor of the election of Richard Nixon in 1960, and Kennedy won. And my father said, okay, that's it. We're all behind Kennedy now. He's the President of the United States. We want him to succeed. And I would take that position. And I would point out that that position has not always been taken recently in Washington, D.C. And my friend Mitch McConnell, and he is my friend, the Senate Majority Leader, when Barack Obama was elected, said, I, Mitch McConnell, have a one-point program to make sure that this president fails. That's no way to run a railroad. So I'll meet you there and then. But thank you for your tone. I enjoyed it very much. Appreciate it. Well, thank you so much, everybody. If I've exhausted everybody's patience and questions, I will go about my business. But you're such a lovely audience. We'd like to take you home with us, and thank you again.